My analysis of this document is from the perspective of a participant who has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars recovering from poor practice uh, and is exploring and wanting to find a good place to have an ayahuasca experience. And also, as someone very appreciative of the positive upside potential of plant medicine and uh, wanting to, I guess, encourage best practices by all concerned, not just practitioners. Um, so the first thing that I would say is that almost all of these things are gray areas. The pharmacology of ayahuasca, that can be a 30-second explanation. It's made from this root and this plant. Or that could be a 3-hour explanation. And so a 1 to 10 scale indicating the amount of skill and depth involved in any of these things is, I think, important. The second thing is that because things are, the risks involved are, I would say they're cumulative. What I mean by that is if you drive a little drunk with like a Tesla in autopilot, and there's good visibility, et cetera, and you're not stressed out, you might have a 1 in 100 to 1 in 1,000%, percent chance of getting in an accident. If you add ice on the road, it may go to 50%. If you have a faulty car, if your wife has just left you, it may go to 80%. And in terms of the margin of safety as to when a particular experience has a probability field of well-being, of success that is high enough to outweigh the risks, it's a cumulative aspect, or it's you're looking at a certain number of risks cumulatively. So, for example, if the shaman has an hour's worth of pharmacological understanding of ayahuasca, but has 1,000 hours of understanding of the risks and contraindications, that may be better. So in other words, a 10 on B and a 1 or 2 out of 10 on 1 may be better, right? So there are certain parts of this that are weighted more towards a statistical outcome, and I'm interested in knowing how much research has gone into actually correlating adverse impacts with these data points, because they're certainly not weighted equally. And then there's a 1 to 10 score in each aspects, and there should be a score below which it is highly advised not to proceed. And there should be a score at which, it could go either way. So if it also ties in with the participant, right? A participant needs a score to say, I have a fragile identity, 7 out of 10. I have PTSD, 3 out of 10. I'm afraid of being out of control, 10 out of 10. A participant should have a score beyond which they should only do ayahuasca in a kind of pretty much perfect setting, and a score at which they should definitely not do ayahuasca, and a score at which the participant is so healthy and so competent that they could be with a terrible shaman with a poor brew and still get a good experience of growth and learning something about themselves. And so that dynamic of the score of the participant combined with the score of the set and setting combined with the score of the practitioner and the score of the assistants, plus the size of the group, right? It's an ecology, and each of these scores kind of affect the overall probable outcome. I would say that these need to be broken down into kind of subcategories. For example, the legal implications. Can your participant go to jail for this? Can your assistant go to jail? Can your practitioner go to jail? That's one level. The other level is there a fine? And then the other level is there a permanent record? Now, those three things, which would affect employment, those three things for the participant, the assistant, etc., should be check marked and broken down as kind of three levels of risk to know who has that risk and how it affects the container. First aid, who has first aid? Is the shaman a certified first aid practitioner? Is the assistant? Are any of the patients? Obviously, the more people certified in first aid in a room, right, the safer that environment is. The theory, there is no theory of non-ordinary states. There are many theories. So which theories correlate with a good outcome? And who best expresses that in which book? So, I've read this book, I've read this theory, or I check mark, I have this belief, I have that belief, I have this belief, with room for other, I think would be useful. And extensive should be broken down, 1 to 10, 20 to 50, 50 to 100, 100 to 1,000. With weighting, you get higher scores, and that kind of overlaps with a lot of this. Like if you have 1,000 ayahuasca experiences and they've gone generally well, that overcompensates for weaknesses here. On the other hand, if you have had very little experience and 20% of them ended badly, you shouldn't proceed without doing more work to get this area, up to, to a high level as compensation with good assistance and all that. This is vague. As a possible shaman, I don't know what that means. And ethics are vague. You have medical ethics, first do no harm. They need to be spelled out, A, B, and C, with check marks and a score given to this area. So, well before, that needs to be defined. At least a month. 2 weeks is okay. Less than a week is not okay, given Western lifestyle and how much time people have to digest and think about, right? So that should be spelled out, that this is the cutoff point, like this is too late, this is rushed, this is okay, and this is ideal. So that both the shaman and the participant can be watching these scores as well. And I would also say these risks need to be spelled out. I believe thyroid is implicated in some of the issues, but I've never had a thyroid test, and I don't know exactly which test to get to go that, to know if I'm at risk around there. Heart rate, what is the heart situation? This needs to be spelled out to both the shaman and the participant. And my goal, by the way, the reason I'm looking at this at all is I have not found any best practices listed at any of the great resorts. So whether we're talking about Rhythmia or Sultana or Blue Morpho, it's incredibly vague, and basically it's down to reviews. And it's not, and since there are some one-star reviews that I can read as a participant, I'm also aware, though, that you can buy and push, positive reviews to drown that out. And so what I'm interested in is knowing how and why those one-star reviews were allowed. Like one of them was talking about the fact that ayahuasca involves snakes, which in Christianity is the devil and serpents, etc. And so her basic idea was that she and her mother had been possessed by demons because there was a snake that entered them during the session. Now, this is poor screening. If you know that 50% of ayahuasca sessions are going, and that was with Rhythmia in Costa Rica. Now, if you know that a cult has programmed its members to associate evil with snakes, and they're coming from a Christian cult that, where that's the predominant belief, where Satan was a snake, etc., and then you're going to be experiencing snakes, that's a screening issue. Because if you believe that snakes are innately evil, as this woman believes, and you're going to expose them to teachings from snakes, they need to change that belief before the session or not go to ayahuasca, right? That's their choice. But you don't just surprise someone with a snake entering you and when the whole Christian heritage is basically scapegoating snakes for all kinds of issues. That's a potential risk. I've never been asked that question by anyone, nor have I seen any screening to that effect. That is a basic thing to screen for, given that this is an English document by a largely Christian culture. These implications should be spelled out for the participant. What are they? The dietary restrictions before and after the session, what are those? And how do they affect the probability field? So I've seen diets without salt, without meat. Is there a difference? If you give ayahuasca to 100 people who eat salt and give it to 100 people with no salt, is anyone tracking whether it makes the slightest difference? If you give ayahuasca to 100 people who eat meat and 100 people who don't, is there any difference? And what is the difference? Is there a difference at 1 week of abstinence, 2 weeks of abstinence, 3 weeks of abstinence? What's the difference if there is one? What would be the optimal amount of time to give up meat in order to prepare for an ayahuasca experience? And are we talking 10% difference? Or are we talking, and is that 10% clearer visions? Or is it 10% higher risk of a psychotic break? What is the difference? Nobody's tracking that to my knowledge. And and yet that is the kind of thing you want to know. Like, I would give up a diet if I knew there was a 10% chance that I would be safer from major psychological adverse effects. If the visions were just 10% clearer, I probably wouldn't. I would eat the food that is comfortable for me. And so that has to be spelled out. And this definitely, like, what are the best practices for staff and participants? Okay, that's good. You have a attached example. I think a link here would be good. I would say that this doesn't print well. Some of this is very vague with small text. So I'm looking at it online, but that would be something. So, for example, this is good. What is the impact on this? At Blue Morpho, because Hamilton Souther is doing a lot of kind of educational, promotional videos, etc. There was no interview, and I actually didn't go to an event because I couldn't schedule any time with him prior to the event. But there was certainly no in-person Zoom or anything. So I'm also interested, like, how much of that affects things. I know for me, I feel twice as safe if I've talked for an hour or so with someone and I'm aware that they are aware of who I am and my history and what's coming in than if I'm not. So I feel twice as good, and I want that to happen before I fly to Peru or something. I don't want that to be there, having paid, having got an airfare, because then you're in a dynamic where if you pull out, you're not given a refund. It's just a bad dynamic. And if you're in a group, there's also peer pressure. So this should be done prior to doing the reservation, and it may be best practice. Just looking at the psychology of it, it may be a best practice to do an assessment where the person pays, $100 to do a detailed assessment prior to signing up, and that assessment is credited towards the journey, but it is kept. And in that way, just psychologically, it is saying that this is an important assessment. So it's not wasting the shaman's time. And it's also not, an exorbitant amount, but it's not free so that the shaman is in a hurry, right? Because that's my sense with a lot of this is, they just want you to sign up in a hurry. And most of the time it works out, right? But it's on you if it doesn't work out. So links here would, of course, be good. Yeah, and I think that a blanket, like if there are black and white areas to reject someone, like we never recommend this, that should be given before people even pay the fine. Like if you have been diagnosed with X, Y, and Z, if you have massive heart problems, just don't waste your time with this. But otherwise, let's do an assessment. So what does this look like? This needs some subcategories. Now this is something that I have some passion around. For example, have you delineated in Dr. Elaine Aron's work on highly sensitive people, HSPs, and other books that, like Susan Cain's book, Quiet, have you delineated, and for example, you can take an Elaine Aron test online in 10 minutes and know if you're in the HSP category. I recommend you do that if you have not, each of you. Now, my experience as an HSP is that my chemistry is different, and that certain things have a big impact. For example, coffee does not wake me up at all. But microdosing mushrooms, for example, often feels like that's plenty. Like someone will say, like, take 4 squares of chocolate for a full-on psychedelic mushroom experience, whatever. Half a square of chocolate is all that I want to deal with as between a microdose and and a session. Now, so we're seeing zero reactivity or low reactivity to coffee. I can have 2 or 3 espressos and barely notice the difference. But a high reactivity to cigars, a few puffs of a cigar will have a big impact. So as I think that people should be encouraged as part of education to know whether or not they are an HSP, number one. And number two, I am not hearing that HSPs are getting a low dose as a test in any of the YouTube videos that I'm watching. But I'm also not being asked any question that would illuminate that I'm an HSP, or getting any awareness that the shaman is aware of what an HSP is. But if it means low reactivity to some substances and high reactivity to others, and that is unpredictable, there should be a different protocol for 10 to 20% of the entire population, which is in that category. And if a lot of the trouble is happening because that category of people is invisible, see, I don't know because it's not being broken down. The protocol should be take the HSP test and put on the form, I am an HSP, I am not an HSP, and the protocol should be a mandatory light dose for an HSP. And I don't think this is a reasonable thing. I can't demonstrate that I understand the personal process and that my participation involves. If you watch YouTube videos, people say that no matter what you think, you don't have the ability to imagine what you're dealing with until you're dealing with it. And then here, so that's where I was going with the HSP. HSPs require more assistance than other participants. I've gone to workshops where I've wanted the assistance of someone for an hour and a half to deal with a traumatic trigger that came up in the workshop. And very few workshops have that level of assistance. If you have one shaman and 2 assistants, and then what are their basic skill sets. What are the skill sets of the assistants, and how are they ranked? Is that being told to the participant? Do they have skills in active listening? Do they have skills in tolerating intense emotions? Or do they get triggered? Because as soon as I see that my therapist or whatever is getting triggered by me, I go into caretaking mode. But I'm not sure if that is even possible, with ayahuasca. Now, so I think that should be delineated as in terms of do not do an ayahuasca session with less than this assistant rate. This is a minimal rate. This is an okay rate, and this is an ideal rate, the ratio of assistants to participants. And that also, I think should be tracked ideally. Now, the issue here is where do you get help from someone that understands the experience? Because this is one of the reasons why I wanted to ensure integration support after my event with the shaman, because the therapist has no idea how to advise, right? This huge snake came into me, and then this happened, and then this happened, and I feel like I'm missing something. What do you think you're missing? I don't know, right? So you're stuck there. But the shaman might very well know, well, that was leading to this when I looked at you. Now this is good. That's good. And it's not practiced a lot, I would say. I was communicating doubts, and people were not saying, well, that's a good reason not to go. They were just saying, well, it's up to you. That's a good way. And that should have a check mark. Do you have that? Because each of these things, like you might be able to deal with poor assistance if you have this, right? But if you have poor assistance and not this, it could be an issue. And that's where that overall score. And so I think this happens to be, a highly weighted stuff, and good to see a link here, a highly weighted area. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if 30% of the experience was influenced by intention, based on what I'm hearing and experiencing from my mushroom journeys. And so that should have a heavier score, and be shown to have, an estimated amount of value. So this bond, I think, should be measured by both the shaman and the participant. Like, as a participant, I feel 3 out of 10 of a bond with my shaman going in. And the shaman should know that that's my number, and I should know how much of a bond the shaman feels with me. And there should be a cutoff point where if it's not strong enough, then you spend some more time to establish the bond. So this is happening, I think, almost no time at all in the jungle. One, I don't know of any lab that can measure it within hours. I think the brew is prepared and you're taking it that night. Now, I don't think it's advisable to hold any sessions unassisted. I think you need a minimum of 1 assistant for any session, because even if you have 2 people and one person freaks out and the other person is lost in the middle of their session, what do? You just leave the one person unattended because the one person is freaking out? I think you need a minimum of one assistant. Yeah, I think the HSPs should get, a smaller dose. I also think you said that tested in advance by the person responsible. I don't think there's time to necessarily test it in the way that it's done, but how important is that? I mean, it does seem important because I've heard wild differences in brew intensities, for different plants, etc. So that does seem like an important thing. But is there time, and how does it impact people to have 3-day-old brew, basically, or a week-old brew? Because if you can make the brew and then do it a week later after the shaman has tested it, and that is a big impact, then that should be done. But is there something about fresh? Has that been measured at all? And if not, is anyone going to measure it? And then have an emergency plan for various scenarios. Both of the incompetent shamans that ended up leading to increased PTSD, there wasn't even a discussion about this. And that leads me to the next thing. Like, I'd like to know which centers are around the world. Have you recruited a single center that holds this as the ideal? Right, because that's step one, to just acknowledge that I think step one is to acknowledge that you should have best practices, which apparently is, that doesn't occur to some people. But then someone or a group or a shaman needs to acknowledge these as their guide to the best practices. And then they need to rank themselves where they are currently. These, like, my ideal would be to do everything in this book. Here's where I am currently, and that gives me a total score of like 74. Now the place might get a score of 50 or 80. But I think I think people that are even acknowledging it as an ideal and who have read this are going to be 2 or 3 times more ethical and safe than people that are not interested in reading this and have no interest in aspiring to it. But then I think it's ethical, meaning the participant needs to know how many of these best practices for their session have been done, right? And this is why I say it would be good if this was science-based, because what you often have in a sales environment, and let's face it, resorts and shamans are making money based on how many people sign up. And once they're already doing the event, it's an extra $1,000 or, or more for each person that signs up, right? And for them, right, if it's one person in 100 has a horrible experience and messes up their life for a year, well, that sounds great if you're not that person in 100. But so you get this thing, well, that's not really important. We don't, they say that at this institute, but they have not done any studies, and we don't have emergencies, so we don't have to have an emergency plan. But I think having that in writing and having that be there for a participant to review prior to the event, these are the emergency plans. Because you don't want to find when you have heart failure that there's no medic on hand and the plan is to ride you in a bumpy road for 6 hours, and that's the plan. You don't want to learn that once you're there with heart problems. You want to learn that before you book the event. These are our emergency scenarios. Where this amount of on a bumpy car, we have a medic that will fly out with a helicopter if you're willing to pay this fee. What are the options? And some of them should be pre-discussed, like you'd check, I'll pay a helicopter or I won't, etc., etc. So this, you know, let's take the scenario I was talking about with Blue Morpho, where there's 2 assistants, there's 1 shaman, and there's 30 participants. Well, what happens when one needs some space and asks for some help and goes out in another room? And then another one gets up and starts wandering off. And then what happens if a third person in a similar, has an issue at that time? Because time stands still, and you really need urgent support at your peak emotional experience level, and feeling like there's no one there and I don't know when there's going to come. That in and of itself can be traumatic. So, but what is the practical logistics? And are the statistics known? Like, what percentage of the time do more than 3 people need help at one time? Now, thinking this through a little bit more, I would say that the shaman, a doctor, a support person after the event, and the participant, as well as so I think there are 5 vital roles in this experience. One is a support person, a therapist, a good friend, one or the other, a therapist or a good friend that knows a little bit of the territory and that cares about you and that will be as a support person on the other side of the experience and preparing for the experience. I think there needs to be that person. Secondly, a doctor to go through, the physical areas where there's a real risk. Thirdly would be the shaman, and then fourthly the participant. And the categories need to be broken down into critical, meaning if you don't get a score above this in the critical section, it doesn't happen. And then you need an important category or a significant impact category. And then these are nice. They're not critical, but they are nice. That way, it can parse out the nice things from the significant things from the critical things. And you would need a critical score on all sides to consider proceeding. And then you would aim and make an effort to get a high score in the significant areas. And then the rest, is just gravy, but you're aware that it's a contributing factor. Now, I also have a question about this. I understand that in larger groups, Rhythmia has 80 to 100 participants. The other participants, well, let's say one in 30 participants is going to start screaming and having a horrific experience. Mirror neurons and just common empathy make it highly likely, particularly for abuse survivors who have been forced and programmed to take care of other people and their abusers so as not to be more abused, will immediately prioritize. I know if I'm listening to someone screaming, I immediately want to know, are they getting help? What should be done about it? And that if I can't do anything about it, it's good for me to get out of the space of someone screaming so that I don't dissociate. But if you have low assistance and a single room, and under no circumstances can someone be left unsupervised, then the attention of perhaps both assistants will be with the person screaming, and there's no one then to supervise me or someone like me from leaving the space so that I can come back to my own experience. So, again, I wonder how much data brings this in. I mean, I think in an ideal world, you don't leave before it's closed, but in an ideal world, you're not overwhelmed by someone screaming and having a horrible experience right next to you. Which brings up, a big point. It's traditional in tribal settings, of course, for, whoever would be relevant to the ceremony to all be together. And so that has kind of led to seemingly a default where there's one shaman and a group of participants. But has any study been actually done to show the difference between a ceremony with one participant, a ceremony with multiple, let's say 5 participants, and ceremonies of 100 participants? Because it seems like that is really relevant data for someone trying to optimize their well-being and minimize risk, and who can afford to pay a shaman to give more attention. It's much easier, it's much gentle. One-on-one, a shaman would be able to both be the shaman and their own assistant. It's a much easier thing to organize. You can do it in a small space, so you don't have to rent a venue. And so for one shaman and one person in a private shaman's home or ceremonial space, or let's say 2 or even 3, for $5,000, they may actually have less stress and preparation, less, you don't need then a private chef and, you name it. If that turns out to be 1.5 or 300% safer, you have a stronger bond, you have more attunement. The shaman per minute of energy or unit of attention actually makes more money or enjoys themselves more. The risks go way down. That model needs to be tested. Now, this yeah, so there was a very strong impulse for one of the participants I was watching on YouTube to lay down, and he was pressured, told, to sit up, don't lay down. But ayahuasca guided him to lay down strongly, so he finally did, and then had a really good experience with that. But here again, when you have one shaman and 50 participants, they can't check in with you about that. And so you have then the general thing of, i.e., one shaman can't keep track of 50 people, so he wouldn't notice that one of them's choking, and so everyone has to sit up just as a protocol. So some of these things, I think, need to be linked to the size of the group. If a shaman can't notice one person choking, because they're lying down, then the shaman is probably not, a very fit shaman. But if, there again, studies showing the benefit of lying, being, sitting up and lying down, I think would be useful. Yeah, and showing best practices around that. What is the range of medicine? Which has the best approach? Is it better to start light dose, and and what are the statistical benefits and problems with using medication? Ample time. I think that should be a minimum amount, an okay amount, and an ideal amount. Again, what does that mean? Is that because I remember the day after my first kind of overdose, etc., when my incompetent therapist, they didn't show up on time. They didn't communicate that they would be late. They just left me hanging, and I had just had the most intense experience of my life. And I think that attachment trauma ties in here strongly, meaning I didn't know it at the time, just through a sustained pattern of picking poor therapists who didn't know what they were doing, which implies that I didn't know what I was doing, so everyone doesn't know what they're doing. I didn't understand what trauma was. I didn't understand what PTSD was. I didn't know that I had it. I didn't know what attachment templates were. And I didn't know that I had an insecure attachment template due to psychological and physical abuse as a child, and how that shows up in relationship patterns today. But what I learned when my therapist, A, didn't show up on time, B, did not answer the telephone, and 3, had not communicated they wouldn't show up on time for the next day session, was I completely freaked out. Everything was amplified. But neither I nor my therapist knew that I had insecure attachment trauma. And so I couldn't communicate it to the therapist, and the therapist didn't bother to ask. And so we're both flying somewhat blind. And it never occurred to me that on such an important thing that a therapist would just not show up for a session and leave me hanging, because that had never happened before. But there's so many things that don't ever happen before in therapy, etc., that I think it's quite important to have that distinction. Are you dealing with a client who has insecure attachment disorder, or are you dealing with someone who has a very secure attachment template? Because smaller things are going to, around reliability and container holding, are going to be much bigger, and it's important to know what those impacts are so both people can discuss them as as contingencies. Yeah, and then what does that look like, and what's the container? I think particularly for insecure attachment trauma, if there's something that is solid and it's there and it's adequate, it's enough. If it's flaky, if someone says they'll follow up and then a month goes by and you haven't heard from them and you don't know what does that mean, that's too flaky, and so it actually can re-trigger abandonment trauma. It could be useful. It's critical to have a questionnaire. One of the things that I find most disturbing as I look back on years of okay to incompetent therapy is that my strategy was to work with up to 3 therapists at a time, and to sample about 20 different therapists and different modalities and energy work, etc. And the first thing that I found was that every one of my therapists or healers had different strengths. The second thing I found was that none of them knew what their strengths were relative to other healers. The other thing was that they all had liabilities, and that none of them knew the way those liabilities affected my session. And not one of them ever asked. And if I wanted to talk about it, their approach was, okay, you pay us $175 an hour to tell us about us and give us feedback if that's how you want to use our session. And we're not going to ask anyone else, so no pattern is going to emerge. As a result, you can have therapists with 10, 20, 30 years of experience that have never done outtake of any kind, have no idea what their relative strengths or weaknesses are. And if you ask them, because I've started to ask any healer or therapist, what are they particularly good at relative to other healers and therapists, many of them have no idea. And not only do they have no idea that that's a bit of a problem. It's not allowing the patient. Like I had one energy healer who I learned by trial and error could clear up back spasms that might otherwise take a week to sort out in bed. He could clear them up in an hour on the phone. So he can do energy work that relieves back spasms. Now he is the only one out of those 20 or 40 different practitioners who could do that. And he didn't know that he was the only one. So he couldn't say, if someone says, if you just say, I'm an energy healer, I'm an energy healer, I'm an energy healer, bullshit. You're really good at this, you're really good at that, you're terrible at this, you're terrible at that, you're nice to talk to, but you don't deliver results, you're rude and horrible to talk to, but you provide a healing touch. Nobody is gathering this information. And the online reviews, which are somewhat good, are only, I think, really accurate after you're done with therapy. And even then, if you've let someone into your life and they know all of your soft and vulnerable points, you of course want them to like you and not validate the part of you that thinks you're completely unlovable and terrible. And so you're unlikely to give a really honest online review of that person while working with them. But that is what you want. You want to know, from people in real time, like this person is 100% reliable to show up on time. They are 70% reliable to be really present when they show up. They're 30% reliable to be highly empathic. And they're 10% reliable to come up with a good suggestion or idea. And I go away feeling better than when I went in, or like I felt served 37% of the time. About 30% of the time, by the time I calculate all the money and time I spent in driving and all that, it's really a wash, right? Because I didn't want to drive there. I didn't want to have to park there. I didn't want to have to cut my workday short and at a critical moment. Did all that, all those costs, then there's the money cost, the time cost, the stress cost. Yeah, and they gave a little bit of help, right? And so it was a wash at best. And then there's the other times where it's worse, right? It's you paid money and took time and added stress and drove there, and the therapist wasn't present and all that. It was worse. And those types of statistics are really useful for the client. And so what I see as I summarize this is that, first of all, there's a strong egoic drive by any healer and therapist to defend against being scrutinized by anything objective. And unfortunately, in my exploration with healers and therapists, I would say that they are more paranoid than architects. And I would say that when I realized just how traumatically illiterate many therapists are and were, and just how fuzzy their sense of ethics are and were, and just how harmful that could be, I tried to do an interview with any number of therapists, well over 100, to try and explore what were best practices in therapy and why, and who was following them. I could not find a single therapist that was willing to go on camera. And the few people that dialogued with me dialogued from the perspective of self-image, meaning I was focusing on how this could help, meaning I was volunteering my time to make this program to help traumatized therapeutic patients. Now, you would think that a traumatized therapeutic patient would be more important to anyone with any empathy than the image of a reasonably successful therapist, in a strong position with their life together and all that. You would think that. But this was not the focus of a single therapist, meaning there was not a single therapist that was dialoguing with me from the perspective of how this could help people. Instead, to the degree that there was any engagement at all, it was, what will I look good in this interview? What questions are you going to ask? What will you do if I don't know the answer to a question? In other words, every one of them were interested in how they would look in the video. And no one was asking any questions of how it would help traumatized clients, engage well with therapists. So that's disturbing. And if I extrapolate that out, meaning that 100% of all therapists that I contacted put their own image ahead of being useful to the public in these areas, let's just make that global and say that 99.9% of therapists would rather not be scrutinized by any objective metric. And that is represented by the fact that I have not found a single psychedelic therapist publishing the metrics upon which they want to be evaluated. And this is remarkable, because if I did the same with architects, which I actually did, I would say that while that architects were much more forthcoming, and that good architects wanted to be in my architectural program, showcasing their work and discussing best practices and all that, right? And so it's suggesting that for whatever reason, therapists are more paranoid about how they look than architects are. But therapists are much more important to our culture than architects. They have much bigger impact on people's lives, and so that's backwards. So how could this work if we use that as a premise that that therapists and psychedelic centers will actively resist publishing metrics upon which they want to be evaluated, i.e., that it will be an uphill battle to get any psychedelic center in the world to say these are the best practices that we can think of in detail, and this is how well we do on that, and this is what we're going to do with you, and you get that up front, and you can evaluate us based on those best practices as you go through your session and afterwards. So that's going to be an uphill battle. So what to do? What to do? Because we're in a political territory here. We're not in healing territory. We're not in ethical territory. We're in political territory, where shamans want to look good compared to other shamans. Centers want to be considered the best center, and of course they're not. So what to do? Well, I think that if you are capable of generating legitimacy, now I'd never heard of you. I had to spend 10, 15 minutes on Google looking for best practices in psychedelics before I came across your organization. And so, I think one thing is to gain more legitimacy. And by legitimacy, I mean that your word would carry, because it should carry, and it would carry from me if on shamanic websites it listed your logo and said, we are a member of, the psychedelic organization focused on best practices. Number one. So that is a selling point, and it is an ego boost, and we are in the domain of ego and politics here. So next, you need to have basic criteria to show that label. And I believe that, first of all, I'm just astounded that something so pivotal in someone's life is as shoddily organized, and that you have toilet cleaners that give more care to their product. They test this, they did. I mean, there are so many things that don't matter. I was in an ice cream shop today, and this person has been carefully trained to do the perfect soft serve ice cream cone. And then dip it in chocolate so that it doesn't drip. Now there's like 15 steps that they do. This, and then this, and then this, and they measure this, and they tap it 3 times, and they do this. And they're taking more care to do soft serve ice cream than many therapists that I encounter, right? And so there's something incredibly backwards that McDonald's will train people to do better steps than all kinds of healers and therapists will train themselves or their clients to do. So that's just atrocious. It's a discredit to everyone in the field. So you seem to be among the most scientific of those out there. You've got Dennis on your board. You know, and you're the first and only useful publication on best practices, which is great. However, we need a 5-minute checklist, meaning as a therapeutic patient who doesn't know what they don't know, as an arrogant Westerner who has no idea what they don't know, one needs to be able to tell in about 5 minutes through checklists, you know, in the critical and important areas, are you in what's your risk factor? Is your risk factor 5%, 10%, 15%? What's your risk factor? And do you need to dive into that more? Because if you're moderate to high risk, you need to do spend a few hours minimal looking into all this. But you need to be able to tell in about 5 minutes through a checklist, do you know this stuff? Because if you can provide that checklist and mandate that the checklist be given to anyone using your label or your logo, then they know what they don't know, and they know what they should be knowing, and they know what to look for in the center and in the shaman. Has the shaman met these criteria? Has the setting met these criteria? And have they met these criteria? If they can do a check mark and do a scoring or do a quick website thing, and it will say, it'll generate a number and say, you need to do more research before you proceed with your session, or 97% of the people in your demographic can kind of have a good setting. But if you want to check out what happens to 3% of the people, look here and read through this. So that's the first thing. A shaman should be able to tell in 5 minutes. There's tons and tons of self-appointed shamans that are too dumb to know that they're dumb. So they need to be able to tell that they're dumb in 5 minutes. And a client should be able to hand them a form from you and say, fill this out. I want this information. And it should say right there that if the shaman gets defensive, as many do, get away from them and get away fast. Meaning if a shaman gets defensive because you hand them a form to disclose where they are in critical areas of competency and they don't want to fill it out and feel affronted, get away from that shaman. That needs to be spelled out there clearly. And there should be some science to back these things up. Because if there is, anyone, there's going to be a big fallout over the next 20 years. And, over the next 20 years, there's going to be thousands of people severely harmed, raped, and injured. And the bad players are going to get shut down over the next 20 years or so. But by the same token, the best players will be elevated and will be over capacity. And that's what you have the capacity. If you do science along this thing, which I highly recommend you do an app that measures each of these protocols and is free, and give it and broadcast it and invite anyone to download the app and give feedback on all of these things before, during, and after experiences. You will then have the best data set in the world because for some bizarre reason, no one else is even gathering the data. And if they do, they're going about it in these horribly inefficient ways with long in-person phone calls and tracking people down. And then, of course, the centers and shamans that are doing rotten work with those people will not give you their names to contact, right? So you're left out and the data is skewed. But if this is, if a shaman will invite you to and encourage everyone in that shamanic session or week to download your app and track it, you will have the best data in the world. Based on that, you can make ongoing iterative recommendations, and then based on that, who's going to follow those recommendations, you can recommend people in different regions, first, second, third, fourth, fifth recommendation, based on that data. And then people can make up their own minds. Now, if you're generating business for people, and other people are going out of business because they're not using these practices and they're not getting recommended, because enough people in the public understand the importance of this, your relevance will go up. People's lives will be saved. Vast amounts of grief and trauma will be saved. And you will have played a pivotal role in the blossoming of real science, database science for people. And this is a critical step in this becoming more mainstream and obvious, because you should also be measuring how much money was spent, how many minutes were spent, how many natural resources were consumed in the plane and all that, and evaluating the positive outcome for the use of psychedelic plants relative to any other healing or transformative modality on the planet.